Still, the will folder warmed my palm as my son leaned in at the graveside and told me he was the boss now. As I smoothed the paper's edge with my thumb, I kept my face still and let the quiet rasp answer for me. While the pages whispered, that sound grew steadier than his breath, steadier than the wind cutting through black coats. The same whisper carried my wife's order and patience, every sheet placed to speak only when it had to. That's when I understood betrayal rushes, but paper waits, and waiting sharpens truth. Still holding the folder, I chose silence and decided to let the pages deliver justice for me. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's... Still, the will folder warmed my palm as my son leaned in at the graveside and told me he was the boss now. As I smoothed the paper's edge with my thumb, I kept my face still and let the quiet rasp answer for me. While the pages whispered, that sound grew steadier than his breath, steadier than the wind cutting through black coats. The same whisper carried my wife's order and patience, every sheet placed to speak only when it had to. That's when I understood betrayal rushes, but paper waits, and waiting sharpens truth. Still holding the folder, I chose silence and decided to let the pages deliver justice for me. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The last hymn thinned into the gray Ohio sky, like breath on cold glass. Folding chairs scraped against frozen grass as people shifted, whispered, gathered coats. The pastor's final amen hung for a moment, then dissolved into wind. Rick Calder stood where he had stood for the past hour, boots planted beside the casket, hands clasped in front of him, not because it looked proper, but because it gave his body something to do, something solid. If he let go, he wasn't sure what would spill out. Late fall had stripped the cemetery bare. No color left to soften the scene, just brown grass, bare branches, and the dull shine of the metal lowering device beneath the box that held his wife of 42 years. Rick kept his eyes on the grain of the wood, tracing it like a map he already knew by heart. He had promised himself he wouldn't break here. Not in public. Not today. People came up in ones and twos, hands on his shoulder. Soft words that blurred together. She was wonderful. She's at peace. Let us know if you need anything. Rick nodded, thanked them, stored every face somewhere behind his eyes without really seeing them. Discipline was the only thing holding him upright. The same discipline that had kept him alive on job sites, in storms, through strikes and layoffs. Feel later. Stand now. When the crowd thinned, Rick sensed the shift before he heard it. A heavier presence, a confidence that didn't belong in a graveyard. Brandon. His son walked up with long strides, coat unbuttoned despite the cold, jaw clenched tight like he was chewing on something bitter. His eyes were dry. No red rims. No swelling. He looked irritated more than grieving, as if the day had inconvenienced him. Rick turned slightly, already knowing what was coming, and still feeling the quiet sting of it landing. Brandon leaned in, voice low but sharp, meant only for Rick. I'm the boss now, old man. For a split second, the words echoed louder than the hymn ever had. Rick felt them hit somewhere behind his ribs, not like a punch, like a weight, like someone setting something heavy down and expecting him to carry it. Rick looked at his son, really looked. The tight mouth, the practiced dominance, the need to be seen taking charge of something, anything. Rick could have corrected him, could have reminded him whose name was on the deed, whose hands paid for every inch of that life. But arguments had a way of feeding men like Brandon. Rick had learned that long ago, so he did nothing dramatic. He nodded. Just once. Small. Controlled. Brandon straightened, satisfied, mistaking restraint for surrender. He exhaled through his nose, like a man who'd just claimed territory. Behind him, Tara stood a few steps back, lips pressed into a thin, pleased smile. She watched the exchange the way a manager watches a takeover, finalize no emotion, just confirmation that the move had landed. Her eyes flicked over Rick, already measuring what would be changed. Sold. Improved. Rick felt Evie before he saw her. His daughter stood off to the side, arms crossed tight against the cold, eyes locked on his face. When Rick nodded, her brow creased. She knew him too well. She saw what Brandon didn't, the way Rick's jaw set, the way his gaze sharpened instead of softening. That look meant one thing. He was paying attention, recording, filing everything away. The casket began to lower. Cables whined softly. Dirt waited. Rick stayed until the last worker looked up, waiting for him to leave. Only then did he turn, walking back to his car alone. No one offered to ride with him. No one followed. The drive home blurred past leafless streets and early dusk, headlights smearing across his windshield. The house greeted him with silence that felt louder than the service had been. Inside, Rick hung his coat carefully. Habit. Respect. He moved through rooms that still held her shape, her lamp, her chair, the faint scent of her lotion in the hallway. He didn't sit. Sitting invited thinking. Instead, he went straight to the bedroom, knelt by the dresser, and unlocked the bottom drawer with a key he wore on a thin chain under his shirt. The drawer slid open. Rick reached past old manuals and envelopes and pulled out a thick folder, edges worn from being handled, reorganized, checked. Across the front, in block letters his wife had insisted on years ago, were two words, "Will plus trust." Rick held it for a long moment, the house quiet around him, the echo of Brandon's voice still fresh in the air. Then he stood, folder in hand, already knowing this wasn't the end of the day. It was the beginning of something Brandon didn't see coming. Morning came too soon, thin light pressing through the blinds like it had something to prove. Rick hadn't really slept. He'd laid still, listening to the house settle, to pipes ticking and floorboards sighing, each sound reminding him of who should have been beside him. By the time the knock came, firm and impatient, he was already dressed, already steady. Brandon didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside with Tara close behind, cold air trailing them like attitude. Brandon held a folded sheet of paper in his hand, already creased from being clutched too hard. No greeting. No, how are you holding up? Just business. I made a list, Brandon said, unfolding it on the kitchen counter like a demand notice. House keys, bank access, insurance paperwork, and this, he tapped the page with a finger, what Mom wanted handled right away. Rick looked at the list without touching it. The items weren't random. They were targeted. Control points. He could almost see the late-night conversations that built it, the assumptions baked into every line. He lifted his eyes to his son. Where'd you get that list? Brandon shrugged too fast. It's just common sense. Stuff that needs doing. Rick nodded slowly. Not convinced, not confrontational either. Silence stretched just long enough to make Brandon shift his weight. Tara stepped in smoothly, like she'd been waiting for the cue. Rick, you're grieving, she said gently, too gently. And that's normal, but finances are complicated. It might be too much for you right now. Rick finally reached for his coffee, letting it buy him a second. Too much. He'd rewired factories, balanced union books, kept this family afloat for decades. He swallowed, felt the heat steady him. Evie entered from the hallway, eyes flicking to the list. Brandon, slow down, she said. It's been one day. Brandon's head snapped toward her. Stay out of it. The sharpness of it landed wrong. Rick saw Evie flinch, then straighten, refusing to shrink. He set the cup down carefully. I'm meeting with the attorney, Rick said, voice even. Soon, Brandon scoffed. We don't need lawyers yet. Rick didn't rise to it. I'll let you know. No yes. No signatures. No keys changing hands. Brandon's jaw tightened. He hated delays. Tara noticed too, her eyes narrowing just slightly, recalculating. Well, Brandon said after a beat. We're moving in. Rick blinked once. You are. To help, Brandon added quickly. You shouldn't be alone right now. Rick looked around his kitchen, the table he and his wife had refinished together. The clock she'd insisted on keeping even when it ran fast. Alone wasn't the problem. Being crowded by people with agendas was. We'll take the back room, Tara said, already deciding. Just temporary. Rick said nothing. Silence again. It did more than arguing ever could. Brandon took it as agreement. They didn't stay long. Brandon grabbed a few boxes from the car, dropped them near the hallway like markers. Tara scanned the house, already seeing upgrades, sales, exits. When they left to get more, the door closed with a finality that made Rick's chest tighten. Evelingel. Duh. I know, Rick said quietly. I see it. She searched his face, then nodded, trusting him even if she didn't fully understand the plan yet. When she left, the house settled again. heavier this time. Rick didn't touch the list. He folded it once, set it aside, and went to the phone. His fingers moved with purpose now, dialing a number he hadn't used in years but had never forgotten. "Denise Klein," a woman answered. "This is Richard Calder," Rick said. "I need an appointment, as soon as possible." There was a pause, then a shift in tone. "Today work?" Rick glanced at the hallway where Brandon's boxes sat like clams staked in dirt. "Yes," he said. "Today works." He hung up, standing alone in the kitchen. The first move made, not loud, not dramatic, but solid. Outside, a car door slammed. Brandon was coming back. Rick didn't rush. He simply straightened the folded list on the counter, already knowing this was only the first claim, and not the last. Rick waited until the house was quiet again. Brandon and Tara had gone out for the afternoon, claiming errands, claiming space the way they claimed everything else lately. Evie had texted that she'd be late, work dragging on. The silence felt different now, no longer just grief-filled, but watchful, like the house itself was holding its breath. Rick carried his suit jacket down the hall toward the bedroom closet. It still smelled faintly of cold air and damp grass, the cemetery clinging to the fabric. He told himself he was just putting things away, returning life to its places. That was how you survive days like this, small order, simple tasks. The closet door slid open with a soft scrape, shelves lined neatly, the way his wife had always insisted. Shoes paired, boxes labeled. Rick reached up to the top shelf to set the jacket aside, and that's when he saw it. Or rather didn't. A clean rectangle of dust, lighter than the rest, an empty space that shouldn't exist. Rick's hand froze midair. His eyes tracked the shelf slowly, methodically, as if the box might reveal itself if he didn't rush. But he already knew. The wooden jewelry box, dark cherry, hand-carved lid. The hinge she'd complained about squeaking was gone. His chest tightened, sharp and sudden. That box wasn't just jewelry. It was anniversaries, birthdays, the bracelet from his first union bonus, the ring she wore when Evie was born, things she touched every morning before facing the world. Rick set the jacket down carefully. Too carefully. "Evie?" he called, though he already knew she wasn't home. He still checked her room, then the bathroom, then the spare closet, moving slower now, deliberately. The box didn't magically reappear. The empty space followed him back into the bedroom like an accusation. Rick pulled out his phone and dialed. "Dad?" Evie answered. "Did you move your mom's jewelry box?" he asked. No edge, no blame. "What?" "No, why would I?" Her voice sharpened with concern. "Is something wrong?" Rick looked back at the shelf. "It's not where it was." A pause. Then firm. "I didn't touch it." "I know," Rick said. And he did. Evie didn't take things quietly. She didn't move memories without saying something. Just wanted to be sure. They hung up and Rick stood there longer than necessary, staring at dust and absence. Then his phone buzzed again. A text. "Brandon. Found some of Mom's stuff. I'll sort it." Rick read it once. Then again. No apology. No explanation of where it had been found. Just ownership of the process. As if gathering her belongings was a chore he'd volunteered for, not a boundary he'd crossed. Something in Rick shifted, not breaking, not exploding, hardening. Grief had weight, but suspicion had shape. This wasn't mourning. This was harvesting. Rick left the bedroom and walked down the hall to his home office. The door was slightly ajar. He was certain he'd closed it earlier. Certain in the quiet way men who pay attention get certain. Inside, the room looked normal at first glance. Desk, chair, file cabinet. But normal had cracks if you knew where to look. The folders in the top drawer were misaligned. A stack he always kept flush, leaned just enough to catch his eye. Papers sat at angles they hadn't before, as if someone had flipped through them too quickly to care about putting them back right. Rick opened a drawer fully this time. Deeds, insurance, old tax returns. Nothing missing that he could see, but something had been searched for. He closed the drawer slowly, then opened the cabinet. Same thing. Close, but careless. The kind of search done by someone in a hurry, or someone who didn't respect the order of the room. Rick sat down in his chair, exhaled, and let himself feel it now. The anger came last. First was the sting of betrayal. Quiet, intimate, almost embarrassing in how deeply it landed. His own son. In his house. So soon after the ground hadn't even settled over her. Rick could have marched down the hall, called Brandon. demanded answers. He pictured the denial, the outrage, the performance. It would turn loud, emotional, slippery. Accusations without proof only taught careful people to hide better. No. Rick stood, went to the kitchen, and grabbed a legal pad from the drawer. He wrote the date at the top, then the time. Then, in plain block letters, he wrote, "Jewelry box missing." Under it, he added the text message, word for word. He didn't editorialize. He didn't guess. He documented. Rick stared at the page, pen hovering. He felt the urge to rush, to act. He pushed it down. Patience had kept him alive his whole life. It would keep him steady now. He closed the pad, slid it into a drawer Brandon hadn't searched, and locked it. From the hallway came the sound of the front door opening. Laughter. Keys dropping into a bowl that wasn't theirs yet. Rick didn't move. He simply listened, already building the timeline, one missing box, one careless search, one quiet step at a time. Brandon arrived with suitcases like he was checking into a place he already owned. Rick heard the car doors first, then the thud of luggage on the porch, followed by Brandon's voice too loud, too casual, directing Tara like a foreman. Rick stayed where he was, seated at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, listening as the front door opened without knocking. Wheels rolled across hardwood. Zippers rasped, territory being claimed in inches and assumptions. "We'll take this one," Brandon said, peering into the spare bedroom, closest to the bathroom. Tara walked past him, scanning walls, windows, corners. "This paint is old," she said flatly. "And the carpet, wow. You can tell this place hasn't been updated in years." She glanced back at Rick like she was doing him a favor. "Honestly, it would sell fast if you staged it right." Rick nodded once, non-committal. He didn't argue. Arguing would have signaled resistance, and resistance would have thrilled Brandon. Instead, Rick picked up his mug and stood. "I'll take the guest room," he said. Brandon blinked. "Dad, that's not necessary." Rick met his eyes. "I like it." It wasn't surrender. It was position. From the guest room, Rick could hear the hallway, the stairs, the kitchen. He could observe without being in the center of the noise. He unpacked only what he needed, folding clothes the way he always had, precise and unhurried, while Brandon's voice echoed down the hall, making plans that hadn't been agreed to. By evening, Tara had already rearranged the living room for Flo. Brandon claimed the garage for storage. Their presence filled the house, crowding corners that used to hold quiet. Rick moved through it like a guest in his own life, calm on the surface, alert underneath. Evie arrived after dinner. Rick watched from the kitchen as she pulled Brandon aside near the back door, voices low but tight. "You can't just take over," Evie said. "This isn't how this works." Brandon laughed, sharp and dismissive. "You're too emotional, Evie. Dad needs someone steady right now." Rick saw her shoulders stiffen. He didn't step in. He didn't need to hear the rest to know how it ended. Brandon didn't listen to warnings. He only listened to leverage. The doorbell rang an hour later. Pastor Glenn Morris stood on the porch, hat in hand, eyes kind but observant. Rick welcomed him in, grateful for the familiar steadiness of his presence. They sat in the living room, Brandon and Tara hovering nearby, not quite eavesdropping, not quite giving space. "I just wanted to check on you," the pastor said softly. "Make sure you're not alone." Rick smiled thinly. "House is full." Pastor Morris glanced around, taking in the energy, the tension that hummed under the surface. "Yes," he said slowly, "I can feel that." They spoke about the service, about Rick's wife, about the weight of quiet moments after loss. The pastor's eyes flicked once toward Brandon, who was scrolling on his phone, already bored. When the visit ended, Pastor Morris squeezed Rick's shoulder a second longer than necessary. "Call if you need anything," he said. It sounded less like courtesy and more like concern. After he left, Brandon's phone rang, then rang again. Rick noticed how Brandon stepped into the hallway to take the calls, voice dropping into something performative. "Yeah, I'm handling the estate," Brandon said. "Dad's taking it hard. I've got it covered." Rick didn't interrupt. He listened. Names floated through the house, uncles, cousins, people who hadn't visited in years. Each call rewrote reality, just a little more. Brandon positioning himself as the center, the authority, the gatekeeper. By midnight, the house finally quieted. Brandon and Tara retreated to their claimed room. Rick sat alone at the kitchen table under the dim light his wife used to leave on overnight. He opened the legal pad again, wrote the date, the time, then he started listing. Claimed spare bedroom is theirs. Suggested selling house. Said Evie was emotional. Told relatives he's handling the estate. Word for word. No commentary, no anger on the page, just facts. Rick paused, listening to footsteps overhead, the sound of drawers opening and closing that didn't belong to him. He capped the pen, closed the notebook, and slid it into the drawer. Upstairs, Brandon laughed at something Tara said. Rick sat still, the house full but trust empty, knowing this wasn't just about space anymore, it was about control, and Brandon was already overplaying his hand. Denise Klein's office smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of place designed to feel neutral no matter what kind of family disaster walked through the door. Rick noticed details the way he always did, the straight-back chairs, the tidy desk, the wall of framed certificates that weren't there to impress so much as to establish order. This was a room where facts mattered. Brandon didn't wait for permission. "I want to read the will now," he said the moment they sat down, leaning forward like he was calling a meeting to order. "There's no reason to drag this out." Denise didn't flinch. She folded her hands once, calmly. "That's not how probate works. A will is read after the proper filings, and notices are completed." Brandon scoffed, loud enough to fill the room. "That's just red tape." Rick stayed quiet. He watched Denise's face, the way her eyes sharpened, not defensively, but precisely, like a surgeon deciding where to cut. "Red tape," Denise said evenly, "is what keeps estates from being stolen." Tara shifted beside Brandon, crossing her legs, lips pressed into a polite line. She smiled toward Rick, the kind of smile that suggested patience with someone slipping. Denise reached into her file. "Before we go any further, there's something you should all be aware of." She slid a document across the desk toward Rick first, respectful of the fact that this was his meeting. Rick recognized the signature instantly, his wife's handwriting, firm and unmistakable. "This is an updated will," Denise said. "Filed 6 months ago." The room went still. Rick felt the breath leave his chest slowly, not in shock, but in something closer to confirmation. His wife had been deliberate. Always was. Brandon's face changed. Not dramatically, no outburst, no raised voice, but something tightened behind his eyes. "Updated?" he said. "That doesn't make sense." Denise met his gaze. "It makes perfect sense if someone wants clarity." Tara leaned forward now. "So, what exactly does Rick plan to give Brandon?" she asked, as if this were a negotiation already underway. Rick finally spoke. "Plans aren't the issue." Denise glanced at him, then back at the file. "There's more," she said. She pulled out another document. Thinner, cheaper paper. Last week, an additional will was submitted online. A photocopy. Rick's stomach sunk. "Last week?" "Yes," Denise said. "After your wife's death." Brandon's chair scraped back slightly. "That's ridiculous. Anyone could have—" Denise raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "The submission included identifying details. It wasn't anonymous." The word "submitted" echoed in Rick's head. Not found. Not discovered. Submitted. Someone had acted, quickly, confidently. Tara's smile faltered for the first time. "Are you saying someone tried to replace the will?" "I'm saying," Denise replied, "that someone attempted to introduce a conflicting document before probate officially began." Rick felt a cold clarity settle over him. The jewelry box, the files, the calls, the urgency. It lined up too cleanly to ignore. Brandon stood. "This is a waste of time," he said. "We're family." Denise didn't look impressed. Family disputes account for the majority of estate fraud cases. Rick rose slowly, meeting his son's eyes. He didn't accuse. He didn't need to. The truth had weight all on its own. Denise closed the file. "I'll be contesting the uploaded document immediately," she said. "And I advise everyone here to be very careful about what they touch next." They left the office in silence. In the hallway, Brandon walked ahead, jaw tight, phone already in his hand. Tara whispered something to him that Rick couldn't hear. Rick lingered a moment, watching the elevator doors close on them. Someone had tried to move first. And now, Rick knew for certain that this wasn't just about inheritance. It was about a replacement already in motion. Denise didn't rush the explanation. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled, voice steady in a way that suggested she'd delivered this lesson too many times to count. Probate fraud usually follows a pattern, she said. You introduce a fake or altered document early, before the court locks anything down. Then you pressure whoever's grieving, confuse them, overwhelm them, make them doubt their footing. While they're off balance, you move assets fast, accounts, property, anything that can be transferred before questions are asked. Rick listened without interrupting. The words didn't shock him. They clarified. Every odd moment of the past few days snapped into alignment, like pieces finally agreeing on where they belonged. He asked only one thing. Who uploaded it? Denise nodded slightly, as if she'd expected that. Digital submissions carry metadata, timestamps, device identifiers, IP trails. It's traceable. Brandon let out a sharp laugh that landed wrong. This is insane, he said. You know who it probably was? He turned toward Rick, voice rising just enough to sound righteous. Evie. She's always been bitter about money. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and abrupt. Rick didn't look at Evie right away. He watched Brandon instead, the way his hands moved, the speed of the blame, how easily it came. Projection dressed up as outrage. Denise noticed too. Rick could see it in the slight tightening around her eyes. Evie didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She simply met Rick's gaze and held it. That told him everything he needed to know. Denise cleared her throat. I'll be filing an immediate notice contesting the uploaded document, she said. That freezes it standing until we verify origin and intent. Rick nodded. Do it. The meeting ended without ceremony. No one shook hands. Brandon left first, muttering into his phone. Tara followed, her heels sharp against the tile. Head down now. Calculations shifting. Rick and Evie walked out together. In the car, Evie finally spoke. I know, Rick said. She swallowed. He didn't even hesitate. No, Rick replied. He didn't. When Rick returned home, the house felt wrong the moment he stepped inside. Not louder, not messier, just disturbed. Like a room after someone leaves but the air hasn't settled yet. He moved down the hall toward his office. The drawer was open. Not wide, just enough. Rick stood in the doorway and watched his son's back bent over the desk, hands inside the file cabinet like they belonged there. Brandon didn't hear him at first. He was too focused, flipping through folders faster now, less careful than before. Rick didn't raise his voice. Looking for something? Brandon startled, straightening too quickly. Jesus, Dad, you scared me. Rick stepped into the room, eyes on the cabinet. You need help finding it? Brandon shut the drawer with a little too much force. Just checking paperwork, since you're busy. Rick nodded, as if that explanation made sense. Right. Brandon grabbed his phone and brushed past him, irritation radiating off his shoulders. We're family, he muttered. I don't get why you're making this difficult. Rick watched him go, then knelt and closed the drawer properly. He didn't check what was missing. Not yet. He wanted the pattern, not the panic. That night, long after Brandon and Tara went to bed, Rick stood alone in the hallway. The house was dark, except for the small lamp at the end of the corridor. He held a compact camera in his hand, no bigger than a deck of cards. He mounted it high, angled toward the office door, and the hallway beyond. No announcement, no warning. When he was done, Rick stepped back and looked at it for a moment, confirming the angle, the quiet red indicator light barely visible. Then he turned off the lamp and went to bed. Down the hall, a floorboard creaked. Rick lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening, not guessing anymore, not accusing, just waiting. Rick treated the next morning like a job. He woke early, before the house stirred, and moved with the quiet efficiency that had carried him through decades of work where mistakes cost real money. He took out his phone, opened a new folder, and began photographing everything that mattered. Not carelessly, methodically. The grandfather clock, in the hall front, side, serial plate. The television, the tools in the garage, the safe, the filing cabinet. He knelt to photograph deed numbers, insurance policy IDs, the backs of framed certificates. Each click wasn't sentimental. It was defensive. This wasn't paranoia. It was inventory. Rick wrote notes to match the photos, cross-checking with old records he knew by heart. He felt a strange calm settle in as he worked. Grief still lived in him, but this gave it rails, purpose. His wife had always said he thought best when his hands were busy. The front door opened hard around mid-morning. "Morning, King." Marla's voice boomed through the house before Rick even stood up. His sister swept in without waiting to be announced, coat still on, eyes sharp and already taking in the tension. She spotted Brandon first, sprawled at the table with coffee like he belonged there. "Let me guess," Marla said. "You're in charge now?" Brandon straightened, bristling. "Someone has to be." Marla laughed loud, unafraid. "At a funeral? You don't crown yourself at a gravesite, Brandon. You bury the dead and shut your mouth." Brandon stood, stepping closer, trying to loom. "You need to mind your business." Marla didn't move an inch. "Oh, this is my business. I watched your father build this family while you borrowed from it." Tara cleared her throat, stepping between them like a mediator who already had a side. "We're just trying to help Rick manage things efficiently." Rick entered the room then, phone still in hand. "I'm managing." Tara smiled thinly. "That's actually what I wanted to talk about. Power of attorney, just for convenience." Rick met her eyes. "I'm still sharp enough to breathe." Marla snorted. Brandon looked away. Evie came in last, pausing mid-step when her eyes landed on Tara. More specifically, on the brooch pinned neatly to Tara's coat. Small, gold, familiar. Evie's gaze flicked to Rick, then back to the brooch. Rick saw it too. He felt the recognition immediately, the curve, the tiny scratch near the clasp his wife had complained about for years. It had lived in the missing jewelry box. Rick kept his face still, his hands steady. He didn't didn't ask. Not yet. Evie's jaw tightened. She didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. The look passed between them said enough. Rick returned to his photos, angling the camera just right. He captured the living room shelves while Tara chatted about streamlining, and Brandon paced like a man annoyed his authority hadn't been recognized. Marla stayed close to Rick, muttering commentary under her breath, daring Brandon to push harder. By afternoon, Rick had documented nearly everything. When he finally stopped, his phone felt heavier, not with fear, but with proof. As evening settled, Tara brushed past Rick, the brooch catching the light again. Rick watched it disappear down the hall, his face unreadable. He went back to the kitchen table, opened his notebook, and added one more line. "Brooke observed, not returned." He closed the book gently. Upstairs, a door clicked shut. Rick didn't look up. The pieces were lining themselves up now, and someone was wearing evidence in plain sight. Rick chose the moment carefully. Dinner had ended, dishes stacked in the sink. The house settling into that uneasy evening quiet where everyone pretended nothing was wrong. Tara leaned against the counter, scrolling her phone, the brooch catching the overhead light every time she shifted. Rick stood across from her, drying his hands with a towel, his tone deliberately mild. "That's a nice piece," he said, nodding once toward the brooch. "Where'd it come from?" Tara didn't look up at first. "Oh, this?" She touched it casually, like it was nothing more than costume jewelry. "Your wife gave it to me. Years ago." The lie slid out smoothly, practiced. Rick felt it land and spread, not like anger, but like cold. Evie looked up sharply from the table. No, she didn't. Tara finally met her eyes, polite smile fixed. "Yes, she did." Evie pushed her chair back slightly. "I saw that brooch in Mom's jewelry box last month, when we were cleaning out the hall closet together." The room shifted. Brandon slammed his hand on the counter. "Jesus, Evie, what is wrong with you? Do you have to make scenes about everything?" "I'm not making a scene," Evie said, voice steady but tight. "I'm telling the truth," Brandon rounded on her. "You're always like this, stirring things up, trying to turn Dad against us." Rick watched it unfold like slow motion, the deflection, the volume, the familiar tactic of turning accusation into chaos. Tara stayed quiet now, letting Brandon burn oxygen for her. Rick folded the towel and set it down. "Put it back," he said. 3 words. No heat. No explanation. The room went silent. Tara laughed softly. "Rick, that's ridiculous. It was a gift." Rick met her eyes. "Put it back." Her smile hardened. "I don't have to prove anything to anyone." Brandon stepped in again. "Dad, come on. You really gonna side with her over this?" Rick didn't raise his voice. "I'm not siding. I'm stating." Tara unclipped the brooch halfway, then stopped, fingers resting on it like a challenge. "You're being unfair," she said. "Your wife and I were close." Evie's breath hitched, but she didn't speak. Rick felt the weight of it then, not just the theft, but the normalization of it. The way Tara spoke as if possession rewrote history. As if saying something calmly enough made it true. Tara let the brooch fall back into place. "I'm keeping it." Rick nodded once. "Okay." That single word confused them more than shouting would have. Brandon opened his mouth, then closed it, recalibrating. Tara's brows drew together, annoyed that victory didn't feel as satisfying as it should. Rick turned away, picked up his phone, and typed with deliberate precision. "We have missing property. Prepare next step." He didn't look up when he sent it. Behind him, Brandon muttered something under his breath. A door slammed upstairs. Tara brushed past Rick, the brooch flashing one last time as she went. Rick stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the house absorb the noise. He felt no rush now. No doubt. They hadn't just crossed a line. They'd done it openly, confidently. And that meant the next move wouldn't be his last, it would be decisive. Rick didn't tell anyone he was going to the bank. He left early, before the house woke fully, the sky still pale and undecided. The drive felt familiar in the way routines always did, turns taken without thought, signals clicked out of habit. He parked in the same spot he'd used for years, the one closest to the side entrance, and sat for a moment with the engine off, steadying his breath. This wasn't panic. It was confirmation. Inside, the bank smelled like polished counters and old carpet. Rick nodded to a teller who recognized him and waited until he was guided into a small office near the back. The banker, a woman named Carla who had handled his accounts for over a decade, smiled politely, then read his face and closed the door. "Everything okay, Rick?" "That's what I'm here to find out," he asked simply. No accusations. No drama. Had any accounts been accessed? Any changes made? Any paperwork submitted he didn't authorize? Carla typed, screen reflecting in her glasses. "Your accounts are intact," she said after a moment. "No withdrawals outside your normal activity." Rick exhaled slowly. Then she hesitated. "There was a call," she added. "A few days ago." Rick looked up. "From?" "Brandon called her," she said. "He asked about beneficiary change forms. General questions." The room narrowed. Not in anger, clarity. "How long ago?" Rick asked. 2 days before the funeral." Rick nodded once. 2 days before they buried her. Brandon had already been shopping for access. Not waiting. Not grieving. Planning. Rick leaned back. "I'd like to place fraud alerts on all accounts." Carla didn't argue. She nodded. "Already printing forms." Rick added another layer, no changes without in-person verification. His signature. His presence. When he finished, Rick stepped outside and called Evie. He told her only what she needed to know. "I can help," she said immediately. Rick shook his head even though she couldn't see it. "Watch quietly. That's help." Back home, the atmosphere was thicker. Brandon noticed the shift quickly. Calls went unanswered. Excuses replaced access. Rick watched from the edges as Brandon paced, voice rising, frustration bleeding through his confidence. "What do you mean they won't talk to me?" Brandon snapped into his phone. "I'm family." Rick felt it then, the edge approaching. Control slipping always made men like Brandon louder, sloppier, reckless. He didn't intervene. He didn't correct. He simply took note. That night, Rick sat at the kitchen table again, notebook open, pen moving steadily. He wrote the date, the bank visit, the call, Brandon's reaction when leverage failed. Upstairs, something hit the floor hard enough to thud. A door slammed. Tara's voice hissed, urgent and sharp. Rick closed the notebook. He didn't need to guess what came next. When men lose quiet avenues, they look for force. And Brandon was running out of quiet. Rick waited until the house was asleep. The television upstairs murmured faintly through the floor, then went quiet. Footsteps faded. A door closed. Rick counted the seconds the way he always had, slow, precise, before he stood and walked down the hall toward his office. He didn't turn on the overhead light. He didn't need to. He knelt beside the wall where the safe sat hidden behind a framed photo. His fingers moved without hesitation, punching in the code he'd memorized decades ago. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Empty. Rick stared at the hollow space, brain rejecting it for a beat before accepting what his eyes were telling him. The will folder sat exactly where he'd left it, thick and untouched. But the slot beneath it, where the property deeds lived, was bare. No house deed, No lake parcel paperwork. No secondary property records. Gone. His chest tightened. Not with panic, but with something colder. Rick closed the safe slowly and stood. He crossed the room to his desk, opened his laptop, and pulled up the camera feed he'd installed days earlier. He scrubbed through footage. Methodical. Patient. Hallway still. Kitchen empty. Then movement. 2:13 a.m. Brandon appeared in frame, barefoot, moving quietly but not carefully enough. He glanced once over his shoulder, then slipped into the office. The timestamp ticked forward. The drawer opened. The safe. Brandon leaned in, blocking the view for a moment, then stepped back. Something thin and rectangular tucked under his arm. Rick watched the clip twice. 3 times. There it was. Not suspicion, not inference, proof. Rick sat back, hands flat on the desk, breath slow. This wasn't impulse theft. This was planning. Deeds weren't sentimental. They were leverage. They were money that could be moved, borrowed against, forged into control. He picked up his phone and called Denise. She answered immediately. Rick, they took the deeds. A pause. Then, firm. That's serious. Tell me how serious. Missing deeds can be used for fraudulent transfers or loans, Denise said, especially if someone's desperate and willing to move fast. Rick closed his eyes briefly. Desperate. That word settled into place like the final piece of a puzzle. Brandon wasn't just greedy. He was cornered. Debt, pressure, expectation, whatever it was. It had pushed him past pretending. I need to report it, Rick said. Yes, Denise replied. Now. Rick didn't hesitate. He called the non-emergency line, then was transferred again. Detective Paige Harmon's voice was calm, professional. Detective Harmon, my name is Richard Calder, Rick said. I need to report attempted property fraud and theft of legal documents. She asked questions. Rick answered plainly. Times, evidence, video, no embellishment, no anger. When he finished, there was a brief silence. Mr. Calder, she said, you did the right thing calling. That night, Rick didn't go back home. He met Denise at her office after hours. She unlocked a private vault, heavier than anything Rick owned, and slid the will folder inside. It stays here, she said. Rick nodded. Good. As he walked back to his car, the cold bit harder than it had all week. His phone buzzed missed calls from Brandon, texts piling up. Rick didn't answer. At home, Brandon paced, unaware that the center of gravity had shifted. The house no longer held the most important paper. The leverage he thought he was stealing had already been moved beyond his reach. Rick sat in his car for a long moment before driving off, hands steady on the wheel. The game had changed. And Brandon didn't know he'd just made his worst move yet. Detective Paige Harmon arrived without sirens or urgency, which told Rick more than flashing lights ever could. She moved through the house with a calm, observant presence, eyes taking in details. Most people missed the scuffed edge of the office door, the angle of the hallway camera, the way Rick stood slightly off to the side as if giving her the room on purpose. She spoke with Rick first. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Rick had been quietly recording truths for nights now. Harmon asked questions in an even tone, not accusatory, not friendly either. Dates, times. What had gone missing? When Rick noticed, he answered simply, sticking to facts. When he mentioned the deeds, her pen paused. Those aren't sentimental items, she said. No, Rick replied. They're leverage. She nodded once. That's what I thought. When she finished, Harmon asked to speak with Evie alone. Rick didn't hover. He moved to the living room and stared out the window, watching clouds slide low and heavy across the sky. He could hear muffled voices from the kitchen, Evie's steady, controlled, explaining without drama. Later, Harmon summarized what Evie had shared. Tara wearing the brooch, the jewelry box missing, Brandon searching the office late at night, the uploaded photocopy of the will. Each detail layered on the last until it stopped sounding like family tension and started sounding like a pattern. I'll need bank call logs, Harmon said, and printer or scanner history if you have access. I can get it, Rick said. As Harmon stepped into the hallway, Brandon came down the stairs mid-sentence on his phone. He froze when he saw her. What's this? Brandon demanded, eyes flicking to Rick. You call the cops on your own family? Harmon held up a card. "Detective Paige Harmon!" Brandon's face flushed. "This is ridiculous." Tara appeared behind him, hand already on his arm, voice low and urgent. "Stay firm," she whispered. "Don't say anything extra." Brandon shook her off. "You're overreacting, Dad." Rick met his son's gaze, unflinching. "Try filing a guardianship petition," he said calmly. "You'll be under oath." The words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Harmon slipped the card into Rick's hand. "Once people realize they're being investigated," she said quietly, "they often destroy evidence." Rick nodded. He'd already been thinking the same thing. That night, the house felt tighter, louder with unspoken panic. Brandon slammed drawers. Tara whispered urgently behind closed doors. Rick stayed still, listening, already knowing the truth had reached the stage where it scared them. This wasn't over. It was about to get uglier. The shift from reaction to control happened quietly. Rick and Denise didn't announce anything. They didn't threaten or posture. They simply began tightening the space Brandon had been moving through so freely. Accounts were frozen with professional courtesy, no drama, just safeguards layered one on top of another. Property filings were locked. The county recorder's office was notified that no transfers, liens, or amendments were to be accepted without direct confirmation from Denise's firm. It wasn't a strike. It was a squeeze. Denise filed the petition, naming Rick as executor the same afternoon, her language precise and unforgiving. Any alternate filings were formally contested, flagged, and boxed into procedural corners where speed no longer worked. Rick read every page before signing, his signature steady, familiar. This was his terrain now: paper, process, patience. Word didn't spread loudly. It didn't need to. Marla handled that part. She didn't confront. She didn't accuse. She called people she trusted, cousins, aunts, old family friends, and told them the truth in a voice that invited listening instead of argument. Brandon had been telling everyone he was handling things. Marla calmly explained that lawyers and courts were, in fact, handling things. By the end of the day, Brandon's version of events had lost oxygen. Calls stopped returning his enthusiasm. Support cooled. Rick noticed the change immediately. So did Brandon. He began hovering, not aggressively, strategically, offering to drive Rick places, suggesting he rest instead of attending meetings, volunteering to speak on Rick's behalf, framing isolation as care. "You don't need to go to all this stuff," Brandon said one morning, coffee already poured, jacket in hand. "I'll handle it." Rick nodded. "You're probably right." The words tasted strange in his mouth, but he said them anyway. He let Brandon believe the pressure was working. He skipped one meeting on purpose, let a call go to voicemail, sat quietly when Brandon filled silences with confidence. Playing weak wasn't natural for Rick, but it was effective. Brandon grew sloppier when he thought he was winning. Evie noticed, but she trusted Rick enough not to interfere. That trust paid off when she went into her mother's closet later that week. She hadn't gone in since the funeral. The space still smelled faintly of her mother's perfume, untouched by time or chaos. Evie stood there for a moment, then reached for a box tucked behind winter coats, a plain cardboard box, labeled in her mother's handwriting. Letters. Inside were envelopes, receipts, notes folded carefully, some yellowed with age, and a small ledger neat columns, dates, amounts, gifts, loans, help given over the years. Most of it pointed one direction: Brandon. Evie carried the box to Rick without saying a word. He sat at the kitchen table and went through it slowly, reverently. Not angry, saddened. The pattern was unmistakable. Support, mistaken for entitlement. Help rebranded as neglect. At the bottom of the box was a folded note. Rick recognized the handwriting immediately. If Brandon turns cruel, don't argue. Document. Rick closed his eyes. She had known. Not everything, but enough. Enough to prepare. Enough to leave him guidance that wasn't emotional, but practical. She'd trusted him to follow it. Rick folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Upstairs, Brandon was on the phone again, voice low and frustrated. Rick stayed where he was, the ledger open in front of him, the truth finally complete. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was ready for the next phase. Rick read the ledger alone at first. He sat at the kitchen table early in the morning, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock his wife had refused to replace. The ledger lay open in front of him, its pages neat, almost gentle in their orderliness. Dates, amounts, notes in the margins: rent help, credit card, car repair, short-term loan. The handwriting never wavered. Neither did the direction of the money. Rick added the total slowly, double-checking even when he didn't need to. Tens of thousands of dollars over the years. Not gifts framed as generosity, but help framed as bridges, support meant to be crossed and left behind. None of it repaid. Not once. Rick leaned back, the chair creaking softly beneath him. Brandon's anger suddenly made sense, not as abandonment, but as expectation. He hadn't felt neglected. He'd felt entitled. Every dollar had quietly taught him that rescue would come, and when it didn't arrive fast enough, he'd rewritten the story as betrayal. Rick closed the ledger and felt something settle in his chest. Not rage, not even disappointment anymore, just clarity. He brought the ledger to Denise later that afternoon. She didn't react emotionally. She didn't need to. She scanned the pages, nodded once, then began organizing it into a clean evidentiary packet. Copies, summaries, context. This counters any claim that he was cut off, she said. It shows sustained support. Rick watched her work, appreciating the way truth became structure in her hands. Brandon had been telling anyone who would listen that he'd been denied, sidelined, pushed out. The ledger told a different story, one the court would understand. Back home, Brandon tried a new angle. "Dad," he said that evening, voice careful, rehearsed. "We should simplify things. Just temporarily." Rick looked up from his coffee. "I found a form," Brandon continued, sliding a paper across the table. "Temporary executor delegation. Just until everything settles." Rick didn't touch it. "I won't be signing that," he said softly. Brandon frowned. "It's just paperwork." Rick met his eyes. "So is a deed." The silence stretched. Brandon pulled the paper back, irritation flashing before he masked it again. Upstairs, Tara had cornered Evie in the hallway. "You're filling his head with nonsense," Tara said sharply. "You want control." Evie didn't raise her voice. "I want honesty," Tara scoffed. "You're poisoning him." Evie walked away without another word and went straight to Rick. She stood beside him at the table, the ledger between them like a line drawn in ink. "They're not grieving," Evie said quietly. "They're scavenging." Rick looked at his daughter, steady, tired, unflinching, and nodded. Upstairs, a door slammed. Rick didn't flinch this time. The truth was no longer fragile. It was documented, and it was waiting. The calendar tightened. Denise moved with purpose now, scheduling probate filings with dates that no longer drifted, they anchored. Subpoenas went out for digital records tied to the uploaded photocopy will, timestamps, device IDs, submission paths. The language was dry, procedural, and lethal in its precision. Once filed, it pulled everything into a lane Brandon couldn't dodge with charm or volume. Detective Harmon called Rick that afternoon. "We traced the upload," she said. "It came from a printer scanner at a co-working space on North High, Caleb's workspace." Rick closed his eyes just for a second. "How sure?" "The access card used belongs to Brandon Calder." The click of it all landing was quiet. Rick thanked her and hung up, standing at the window as traffic slid past like nothing in the world had changed. In the house behind him, something had. Brandon felt it. He softened overnight. Smiles replaced scowls. He offered coffee, asked about Rick's sleep, mentioned memories from childhood like they were currency. He lingered in doorways, leaning in with lowered voices. "We're family," Brandon said one morning, hands open. "People make mistakes. We don't have to turn this into a war." Rick listened without reacting. He nodded at the right places. Let Brandon keep talking. The longer Brandon spoke, the more he contradicted himself, admitting urgency here, denying knowledge there, reframing actions as misunderstandings that didn't line up with yesterday's explanations. Rick didn't interrupt. Stillness did the work for him. Outside, Marla arrived unannounced and caught Tara near the driveway, keys in hand. "You need to back off," Marla said, blunt as ever. Tara smiled thinly. "We're not backing off anything." Marla stepped closer. "You're pushing too hard." Tara's smile vanished. "We'll take everything," she said quietly. Not a threat dressed up as a joke. A promise. Marla watched her get into the car and drive away, jaw set. That evening, Rick changed the locks. He did it himself, hands steady, movements efficient. No anger, just boundaries. He tested each door twice, then handed Evie the spare. "Don't lose it," he said. "I won't," Evie replied. The house felt different after quieter, but also cleaner, like something toxic had been aired out. Brandon noticed immediately, his confusion flashing into irritation, then into something like fear. Rick didn't explain. He didn't need to. Night settled in heavy and cold. Rick sat alone at the kitchen table, the will folder in front of him for the first time in days. He opened it slowly, reading through the pages, not for surprises, there were none but for resolve. His wife's voice lived in the margins, in the clauses she'd insisted on, the foresight she'd trusted him to honor. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. A door closed softly. Rick didn't look up. Tomorrow, everything would be said out loud. He closed the folder, squared it with the table's edge, and stood. The house was ready. So was he. Denise Klein's office felt smaller with witnesses present. Not crowded, compressed. 2 clerks sat along the wall, quiet and observant. A court recorder adjusted her device. The air carried that same neutral scent of paper and polish, but now it held tension too, drawn tight like a wire. Rick sat upright at the table, hands folded, the will folder resting in front of Denise at last. Brandon couldn't keep still. He shifted in his chair, leg bouncing, jaw working as if chewing on something bitter. Tara sat beside him, posture rigid, fingers laced too tightly in her lap. She wore confidence like armor, but it no longer fit cleanly. Evie sat on Rick's other side, calm, attentive, eyes forward. Denise opened the folder. "The last will and testament," she began, voice precise, unhurried. "Executed 6 months prior to Mrs. Calder's death. Properly filed and witnessed." Rick felt the words move through him, not relief, not triumph, completion. Denise read carefully, clause by clause. When she reached Brandon's name, the room sharpened. "Brandon Calder is to receive a fixed distribution," Denise said. "A one-time amount. No managerial authority, no discretionary control." Brandon straightened. "That's it?" Denise continued, unbroken. "The distribution is contingent upon compliance with all probate proceedings and good faith conduct." Tara leaned forward. "What about the house?" Denise didn't look up. "The marital residence passes to Richard Calder by right of survivorship." Rick didn't move. He already knew. Hearing it out loud didn't swell his chest, it steadied it. "And the family trust," Denise went on, "names Evelyn Calder as successor trustee." Evie inhaled quietly, then nodded once. Denise paused before the next page. "There is an additional clause," she said. The silence deepened. "In the event of any proven attempt to alter, replace, forge, or fraudulently submit estate documents," Denise read, "the offending beneficiary's distribution shall be reduced to a symbolic sum of $1. The room broke. "What?" Brandon shot to his feet, chair scraping hard against the floor. "That's insane!" Rick stayed seated. "You manipulated her," Brandon shouted, pointing at Rick. "You turned her against me." Denise closed the folder halfway, not flinching. "Sit down, Mr. Calder." Brandon didn't. His voice cracked, volume rising, accusations spilling out without shape. Years of entitlement poured into minutes how he'd been sidelined, ignored, underestimated. How this was theft dressed up as legality. Rick listened without expression. He didn't defend. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Denise waited until Brandon burned himself out just enough. Then she slid a thick packet across the table toward the recorder. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "we submit evidence of attempted fraud." She laid it out piece by piece. The uploaded photocopy will, the metadata trail, the co-working space printer, the access card tied to Brandon's name, the missing deeds, the video timestamp, the bank call logs, the ledger. Paper didn't argue. It stacked. Brandon's color drained with every page. Tara's hand slipped from his arm. Rick watched his son realize it, not all at once, but in painful increments. The funeral, the words, "I'm the boss now," the speed, the arrogance, the assumption that no one had planned for him. His wife had. She hadn't fought Brandon directly. She designed a perimeter, a trap that only closed if someone tried to take more than they were given. All Brandon had needed to do was wait. He hadn't. Brandon sank back into his chair, breathing hard, eyes darting between the papers and Rick. For the first time, there was no script left. Rick finally spoke. "Your mother loved you," he said quietly. "But she trusted facts more than promises. The room fell silent again, not tense now, but final. The will folder lay open between them. No longer a mystery. No longer a weapon. Just the truth. Exactly where it had always been waiting. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. After reviewing the filings, the evidence packet, and the testimony laid out by Denise, he leaned forward slightly and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen this pattern before. "An investigation will be opened into the uploaded photocopy will," he said. "This court orders a full review of its origin, submission, and intent." The words landed like a door closing. Detective Paige Harmon was already moving, her notebook open, posture professional, eyes fixed not on Rick but on Brandon. "We'll be proceeding with charges related to forgery and attempted fraud," she said evenly. "Not a threat, a process." Tara stood abruptly. "This is a misunderstanding," she said too fast. "We were just trying to help. Things got confused." Her voice shook on the last word. No one answered her. Brandon finally exploded, not in strategy now, but in panic. "This is insane," he shouted. "You did this, Dad. You and Evie. You set me up." Rick didn't react. He watched his son unravel with the same stillness he'd learned on job sites when a machine failed. Observe first, move only when it mattered. Brandon kept going, his anger spinning outward, desperate for somewhere to land. He blamed Evie for poisoning Rick. He blamed Rick for favoritism. Then, impossibly, he blamed his mother for planning, for control, for not trusting him enough. That one cut deepest. Rick felt it then, the full weight of it. Not triumph, not relief. Loss stacked on loss. A wife gone. A son exposed. The final confirmation that the man Brandon had become wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a choice. Evie's hand found Rick's arm. She leaned in close, voice low. "Boundaries are love," she said. "Not cruelty." Rick nodded once. He needed that reminder more than he expected. The proceedings ended without ceremony. No dramatic ending. Just orders, timelines, and consequences set into motion. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper. Brandon didn't speak on the drive home. Tara stared out the window. Mascara smudged now. Control finally cracked. When they arrived at the house, 2 officers were already there, civil standby, polite but firm. Rick stood in the doorway as Brandon argued with someone who wasn't listening anymore. He watched his son gather clothes in armfuls, movements jerky, careless. Tara tried one last time to appeal to reason, to family, but the words wouldn't organize themselves. "This is your fault," Brandon said to Rick, standing in the hall with a bag slung over his shoulder. Rick didn't answer. He didn't need to. The door closed behind them with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. The house went quiet. Rick stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, grief pressing in where adrenaline had been. Evie stayed with him, steady, present. Outside, the patrol car pulled away. Nothing felt resolved yet. But everything had changed. The house felt different without noise to push against. Rick stood just inside the doorway after Evie left for the night, keys still in his hand, listening to nothing. No pacing upstairs, no murmured arguments behind closed doors. No tension vibrating through the walls. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was exposed. It made the absence of his wife sharper, like the house had finally admitted who was missing. He set his keys down slowly and walked through the rooms one by one, reacquainting himself with the space. Every object felt heavier now, that there was no crisis to manage, no strategy to execute. Grief had waited patiently for its turn. Marla came the next morning, practical as ever, bringing coffee and no platitudes. She didn't ask what he needed. She just followed him into the bedroom and began opening drawers with the same care his wife would have used. They worked quietly, folding, sorting, setting things aside without rushing. Marla didn't touch anything sentimental without asking. She let Rick decide what stayed, what moved, what waited. When Rick sat on the edge of the bed too long, staring at a sweater still shaped by memory, Marla pretended not to notice. It was in the garage later that afternoon that Rick found it. A plastic bin shoved behind paint cans and old holiday lights. He knew before he opened it. The lid popped free, and there it was, the jewelry box, scratched, lighter than it should have been, half emptied. Rick didn't pick it up right away. He crouched there, the concrete cold beneath him, and closed his eyes. The anger didn't come, just a deep, dull ache. Theft was easy to understand. Betrayal took longer. Evie helped inventory what remained. She made neat lists, cross-referencing dates and descriptions for Detective Harmon. Ring missing, necklace present, bracelet clasp broken. She worked with quiet focus, giving Rick space to sit with what couldn't be itemized. Denise called that evening. Her voice was calm, reassuring in its precision. The deed filings were secured. The trust was locked down. No further changes possible without multiple verifications. The structure was sound. Rick thanked her and hung up. He stood alone in the living room after dark, lights off, looking out at the street. The porch light cast a familiar glow, unchanged by everything that had happened. For the first time in weeks, Rick wasn't bracing for the next move. That was when the ache really set in. Not the anger, not the sense of being wronged, but the quieter grief of knowing his son had chosen this path. That something had been permanently altered, not by paperwork or courts, but by trust breaking in a way that couldn't be repaired by time alone. Rick sat at the kitchen table where he'd written everything down, where strategy had replaced sleep. He closed the notebook and slid it into a drawer. Not locked now, just finished. Tomorrow, he would start making choices again, real ones, about how to spend his time, who to let close, what his life looked like without fear driving it. He walked upstairs and stood in the doorway of the bedroom. The bed neatly made now, the air still holding a trace of her. Rick didn't step inside yet, but he would. Not because he had to, but because he was ready to rebuild, carefully, deliberately, on his own terms. Rick returned to the Union Hall on a gray Tuesday morning. The building hadn't changed. Same scuffed floors, same bulletin boards layered with decades of notices, same smell of coffee that had been reheated one time too many. What had changed was the way Rick walked through the door, not as a man escaping something, but as someone stepping back into a place that still knew his name. The younger workers recognized him, even if they didn't all know why. Word traveled quietly in places like this. A few nodded. One offered a chair. Rick declined and stood, leaning against the wall as he listened. When questions came, they were practical: how to handle a foreman cutting corners, how to push back without burning bridges. Rick answered the way he always had. Slowly, honestly, without bravado. Mentoring wasn't authority. It was presence. Later that week, Rick met with a local trade school and set up a small scholarship in his wife's name. Nothing flashy, enough to help one student a year get tools without debt. When he signed the paperwork, he felt her there not as memory, but as continuation. Legacy didn't have to be loud to last. Evie helped him go through the closets next. They donated clothes and furniture Brandon had mocked as outdated. Rick watched items leave the house without resentment. They'd served their purpose. Letting go felt different now, lighter. Evie worked beside him, sorting without commentary, understanding that dignity lived in quiet decisions, not arguments. Rick realized that obedience had never been what he wanted, not from his son, not from anyone. He'd wanted steadiness, responsibility, the ability to stand in the same place when things got hard. That truth followed him when Pastor Morris stopped by one afternoon. They sat on the porch, coffee cooling between them, the street calm. "How are you holding up?" the pastor asked. Rick didn't deflect this time. "I get lonely," he said, saying it felt like releasing pressure. "Not scared, just empty sometimes." The pastor nodded, no judgment, just understanding. A week later, Rick sat in a therapist's office, hands folded, back straight. He wasn't there because he was broken. He was there because he was honest enough to know strength didn't mean silence. He spoke about grief, about betrayal, about the strange relief of clarity after chaos. The therapist listened. At home, the house began to feel warmer, not because anything physical changed, but because Rick had stopped bracing for impact. He turned lights on in rooms he'd avoided, let the radio play in the mornings. The silence softened. One evening, Rick stood in the kitchen and realized he was breathing easier. Not healed, but steady. And for the first time since the funeral, that felt like enough. Brandon called late in the afternoon. Rick watched the phone ring twice before answering, his expression unchanged. Brandon's voice came through thinner than Rick remembered, careful, almost polite. "I just want one meeting," Brandon said. "For closure." Rick considered it, not because he needed it, but because Brandon did, and because avoiding it would leave space for unfinished noise. "A diner," Rick said. "Public." They met 2 days later at a place Rick had eaten at 100 times over the years. Vinyl booths, chipped mugs, a counter that smelled like grease and coffee. Rick arrived first and took a booth near the window. Evie sat at the counter across the room, close enough to see everything, far enough to stay out of it. Brandon walked in a few minutes late. He looked smaller, not physically something else. His shoulders were tight, his eyes restless. He slid into the booth and stared at the tabletop like it might tell him what to say. "I'm sorry," Brandon said finally. Rick waited. "I didn't mean for things to go that far," Brandon continued. "I was under a lot of pressure. You know how things are. Debt, expectations. I just needed help." Rick nodded once. "Not agreement. Permission to keep talking." Brandon rushed to fill the silence. He talked about stress, about feeling sidelined, about how Tara had pushed, how things spiral. Apologies tangled themselves with explanations until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Rick listened without interrupting. He noticed how Brandon never quite landed on responsibility, how blame always slipped sideways, landing on circumstances, on people who weren't in the booth. When Brandon finally stopped, Rick spoke. "You wanted power," he said. "Not family." Brandon flinched. "That's not—" Rick raised a hand gently. "You didn't want to help. You wanted control. Over the house. Over the money. Over me." Brandon stared at him, searching for something familiar. Anger, pleading, leverage. Rick gave him none. "There's one path forward," Rick said. "Accountability. Restitution. Distance." Brandon swallowed. "Distance? Yes. No more pressure. No more access. You make things right where you can, legally and honestly, and you live your life without trying to manage mine." Brandon's eyes flicked toward Evie at the counter, then back. "So, that's it?" Rick took a sip of his coffee. "That's it." For the first time, Brandon seemed to understand something he hadn't before. Rick wasn't negotiating. He wasn't begging for love. He wasn't trying to fix his son. He was done chasing. Brandon leaned back, defeated in a way anger never allowed. "You're really okay letting this go?" Rick looked out the window at the passing cars, ordinary lives moving forward. "I already have." He stood, placing a few bills on the table. Evie caught his eye from across the room and nodded once. Rick didn't look back at Brandon as he walked out. The bell, over the door, chimed softly behind him. Rick stepped into the cold air and felt lighter. Not victorious, not relieved, but free. For the first time in a long while, Brandon's shadow didn't follow him out. Early winter had stripped the world down to essentials. Rick parked at the edge of the cemetery just after sunrise, the sky pale and clean, breath fogging in front of him as he stepped out with a small bundle of fresh flowers tucked under his arm. The ground was hard, the grass brittle with frost, every footstep sounding louder than it should. No service today, no audience, just him. He walked the familiar path without hurry, past stones he'd seen dozens of times since the funeral, until he reached hers. The marker was simple, exactly what she'd wanted. Rick knelt carefully, brushing away a few fallen leaves before setting the flowers down. "I followed your plan," he said softly. His voice didn't shake. It surprised him, even when it hurt, especially then. He stood there a long moment, hands in his coat pockets, letting the quiet do what it always did, strip away performance. He didn't apologize. He didn't justify. He simply told her the truth, that he'd protected what they built, that he hadn't let noise or guilt rewrite the work of a lifetime. Footsteps approached behind him, light and familiar. Evie stopped a respectful distance away. "Morning," she said quietly. Rick nodded. "Morning." She stepped closer, eyes on the flowers. She would have liked those. Rick smiled faintly. "I know." They stood together, sharing memories without bitterness. Small ones. A road trip that went wrong. A recipe that never quite worked but was made every holiday anyway. Laughter came easily now. Unforced. Not chased away by pain. Rick felt something settle in his chest, not absence, but alignment. Later that afternoon, Denise called. "It's done."